Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our talk on why Houdini is the best. This might be very interesting for a lot of people. And first of all, we have to make sure that there's no minors in the room, because actually our talk is called like that. This is our actual title, and we don't want to say that anyone is stupid. Just to make that sure, it's obviously a joke, and I want to explain what we mean by that.
I mean, we're stupid sometimes.
Sometimes, yes. So the thing in the past was that in most software packages, you're working with black boxes, and you might know that. And you put something in, and then something magically happens or not, and you get something back or not. If it doesn't work, then you have a problem. So the cool thing about Houdini, however, is that there's basically no black boxes. You can check out any high-level node and see exactly what's going on.
Yeah, so for us, it's really a fantastic software package because of its level of control, flexibility, and the fact that you can see exactly what's going on. That is, if you get used to having this thing open. So while action figures are pretty cool and all, it's even cooler to get all the parts and building blocks to build anything you want, really. So if you can't solve a problem with what you know at the moment, just expand your horizon and connect the dots. The solution is definitely out there, you just don't know it yet. And always remember, the only limit is your knowledge.
Yeah, so who are we? My name is Simon. I've been working as a 3D artist for over 10 years now and picked up Houdini about 7 years ago.
And I'm Bastian. I've been working in design for about 14 years now, and I always like coding. So watching Simon learn Houdini was super exciting for me, and then I slowly switched over to Houdini about 6 years ago.
So this is the studio space that we share with a couple of very talented guys, some of which are also doing a talk here at FMX. So if you're into character animation in Cinema 4D and compositing, check out Can and Andy's talk at 4. Say hi. So
5.
5. Sorry, 5. They're sitting here in the room as well. And let's maybe first take a quick look at our shared reel that we quickly put together for FMX, so you can see what we use Houdini for when doing commissioned work or when we help our friends at various studios. One thing we have to add is that it's usually a team effort, and we're lucky that other people make our stuff look super nice.
Okay, we're rolling, you can play.
All right, so today we'll be showing you a couple of quick tips and also some more high-paced speedruns through a couple of our projects. So we hope you've had your morning coffee, the bittersweet juice of our working lives. So let's start with one of the newer projects I did with Andy, a super talented designer at Baked in the UK. And this is them, so definitely go check out their portfolio. They're super talented guys doing very awesome stuff. So for this film, Andy wanted to show the sole of the shoe to grow a bit like construction foam. So this is one of those speedruns, so pay close attention. So we start with the upper part of the sole. To make it grow, we turn it into VDB. Intersect that VDB with a second VDB made from a sphere, and create a fork VDB that we'll use as a mask. In a solver, we use a VDB morph, so our start shape gets sucked into the final shape of the sole. Now that we have our basic growing shape, we scatter some points on the original surface and mark them as active when they're inside the growing VDB. So they turn orange. I don't know if you can see it once they're inside the purple mesh. they're active. In another solver, every frame we increase an H attribute on all those points that are marked as active. Based on that new H attribute, we set a p-scale and scale attribute for some non-uniform scaling of our bubbles. We then copy a sphere onto our points with the p-scale and scale attributes and have the start shape of our growing bubbles. All right, we now turn those bubbles into VDB, run that VDB through a VDB smooth SDF, and have a nice and bubbly growing VDB. We need a mesh, however. So if we use the convert VDB sub, we're lacking our UVs and are stuck with the generic mesh of the convert VDB. So to get back our original topology, we get the growing VDB for the sole and clip the original mesh with it, polyfill it, which leaves us with a growing proxy mesh, like this. Next, we run that growing proxy mesh with the meshed growing VDB and our static original mesh through a solver, where we mask the boundary points, blur their positions, and then project those boundary points onto our growing mesh. So we end up with a growing version of our original mesh with all the initial attributes we had. All right, next we filter our bubble source points by age and create a mask on a remeshed version of our static sole. We then displace those points based on that masked attribute, which looks like this, and run our static and displaced mesh through a ripple solver to get a smoothly moving rippled mesh. And you'll see where I get it in a second. We now point deform our growing bubble mesh from before with the deformed mesh to get a nice organic motion on top of our growing mesh. So it moves a bit more organic. Next up is the lower part of the sole that should smoothly slip on from below. So we split the lower part of the sole, apply a bend, which isn't looking too organic at first, like this. So we run those points through a chop net with a spring chop to again give it a nicer feel. If we now point deform our high-res version, we get a nice and organic effect for the lower sole. Now there's still some intersection with the upper sole, which we can't have. So we blast everything except the top part of our low-res lower sole, calculate the difference between our static top and the moving one in a wrangle, and accumulate that mask in another solver, so the mask can't grow back. If we go back out, we get a mask that kind of precedes the moving lower sole, like this. With that nice fall-off on the mask, we now pull the static mesh towards our moving mesh using a lerp function. So within the mask, our static mesh follows the lower sole. To fix the initial part of the intersection, we simply add an additional bend deformer that we time by hand. So it moves out of the way in the front. If we now use that low-res shape to point deform our growing bubble mesh, the lower part of the sole nicely pushes the upper part out of the way. Now we merge both point deforms, and we get a nice and smooth growing upper part of the sole with a smoothly sliding on lower part. Like this. And now Andy did his magic and made the whole thing look super nice.
All right. So I was contacted by a design studio from Berlin with the funny name Sucuk and Bratwurst to create some fun animations for the upcoming release of Rihanna's vinyl collector boxes of her albums. It was a series of very quick animations where a record transforms into an object that represents the album. And as usual, I had to work fast and find quick and adaptive solutions for the scenes. So as you could see, I needed to animate this flower, and instead of building it from scratch, I got the 3D model of the rose, and the problem here was that this is the final deformed state of the animation, and I needed to find a good way to rig it backwards and make the petals curl inwards. So a simple loop helped me to isolate a single petal, and as soon as everything works, the loop will easily adapt the operations to all petals. I used a polyframe node to create those two vectors for each point. You can see them here, the red and the green one. So it takes the first two edges of the primitive and creates those vectors, and the one which will be used later as a rotation axis for the curl effect is called tangent U in this case here. Luckily, the 3D model had proper UVs, which I could use to find the center line of the points on the petal. So I simply checked which points had their UV coordinate between 0.4 and 0.6 with this simple expression. And so I knew that those points are more or less in the center line in the UV space and could be used as a spine. The only problem was that the point numbers of the isolated points were a bit mixed up. I don't know if you can see that. It started with 1, 0, 4, and so on. And to sort them again, I used the UVs, this time the V coordinate, to bring them in the right order. And the next thing was to simply connect them with a polyline and run the whole process via the for each loop over all the petals. And this gives you this result here. So now each petal has a spine exactly in the middle of the leaf. And the result can be fed in a skeleton sub, which creates all the necessary attributes to be used in KineFX. And a simple rig attribute wrangle can now be used to rotate and scale the segments of our spines. So I used a simple slider that I could animate the transition and a ramp to make the tips curl a bit stronger than the rest so that you get a nice spiral in the end when you have the slide on one side. And at the moment you can see that the movement is quite linear and all the spines do their stuff at the same time. So I time offsetted them a little bit using a loop, I think. So the ones on the outside start first and the ones in the middle are offsetted for a few frames. And I used a spring chop to add the secondary motion here that it wobbles a bit at the end of the animation. And the last step is to simply use a point deform to transform the animation onto the original model. And the best feature of the setup is that you can easily move or add petals if you want, and the rig will update itself at the animation, the secondary motion, and transform all the new petals exactly the way I want it.
Which is one super cool thing about Houdini.
Yeah, of course, again.
So this was a really cool project directed by Simon here for Cloud in the Sky Studios in Canada about an artificial intelligence that controls the room temperature. He wanted to visualize the artificial intelligence as kind of a revolving Rubik's Cube. So this is the scene file for the AI cube consisting of the cube itself and various graphical elements around it. For animation and previewing purposes, the animation was done on a proxy cube, which could be previewed in real time. And then the first step was to set up the Rubik's Cube solver itself. There's a super nice tutorial on sidefx.com that you should also check out if you're interested in that kind of effect. And I based my main setup on that tutorial as well. Because often we need to move quite fast, and so you need to find like a quick solution and can't have a very long R&D time on the projects. So the proxy cube consisted of a core and a shell, which then were booled with two cutters. Here's the core and the shell. In the end, we had 16 packed primitives. Now in our cube anim object, we have two subnets. The first one shuffles the cube with a couple of main parameters that you can see up in the parameters tab, and a couple of tweaking parameters that could, for example, control the easing of the rotations with a ramp. The second subnet explodes the pieces against something that wasn't used in the final shot, but I didn't know back then. This is what it looks like in that open state when the cube opens up. Now on the shuffle cube, we can set a constant frame rate, like 3 FPS here. So it keeps shuffling or animate the frame rate. So now we kind of have a variable frame rate for the shuffling. We can limit which layers should rotate. So we can set it to the right layer, and now on the right layer rotates. And animate those layers as well. So you can really art direct and fine-tune that movement. So first we rotate the right half and then the left half. You can also specify whether the shell or core should turn. So if we now keyframe the explosion of the shell, you see what that looks like. Something I thought was super cool, but yeah, ended up not being in the...
Because clients.
Yeah. Now if we take a look inside the shuffle cube subnet, we really only have two parts. A solver, which kind of records what's happened so far. In that solver, there's as so often just one wrangle updating the various detail attributes, which you can see on the lower left in the geometry spreadsheet. So if we let that solver run, you see in the geometry spreadsheet that it merely records a history of what has happened so far. So you see how many turns it did, and whether to turn the core, what to turn, and whether to turn the shell. So now in the for loop, that's running by count. That is slightly inefficient, and I probably would do it different now, but back then I didn't have the knowledge. I was stupid and didn't have the time. So each frame, it runs through the whole history of what's happened until then. So by the end of our demo, it needs to run 18 times per frame because there are 18 turns in the end, as you can see, turn 17 in the lower left. Talk about being stupid. So each iteration, it figures out, like the loop, figures out which parts are where and updates the groups for top, bottom, left, right, and so on. Because you can't have static cubes. If you shuffle it, the top group maybe becomes the right group, so you constantly have to reevaluate what's on what side. We then have 6 transforms, like 6 possible transforms, all 3 axes, back and forth, that also take into account the current angle on the detail that you can see in the lower left here, and the ramp on the outside of the subnet. And a switch which picks the correct rotation for the current frame. So that was like super tricky to understand at first, and yeah, it works. We then need to update the groups for the crosses for X, Y, and Z as well. And you need you'll see why in a second, because one level up with the animation applied, we still have a problem that the crosses, like the tiny crosses on top and front and right, intersect with the cube if it's turning in a particular direction. So the scale crosses subnet fixes that. We check which lines are in the way in another wrangle. And as always, run that attribute through a chopnet to get a nicer movement. We then apply the animation, and we have our problem solved. It's a bit hard to see. You can see it in the front. So if a line is in the way, it kind of scales down before the turn, and then scales up again. So tiny detail, but that's what we live for, right? Now for the detailing, we animate our base layer with a grid that we slice a couple of times, run that through a chopnet, again, for some nice organic motion. We then extrude the faces based on the area of the primitive. So we get this. We get the complement, so it makes a nice cube again. And we're done with one tiny cube. Now there's a little bit of work left to get the high-res cubes back onto our proxies. We get our high-res cubes up there, pack the individual elements, and run a mobs shape fall-off over our packed primitives that are frozen to frame 1. So we get this. This is the fall-off on the static. We then apply the transform, so they scale up. duplicate the cube 8 times, so we get 8 individual copies that we can time offset in a loop, reset the position, and copy to point those animated high-res cubes onto our low-res proxy. So that's it. We now have our 8 high-res cubes on our low-res proxy. So here's the final shot again with all those elements, minus the shell and the nice exploding effect. Yeah.
All right. So the next setup I want to share is from the same project that Basti just presented and uses a neat little trick that I picked up a few years ago. So a lot of times people use infection setups for effects that grow over time. And there's a simple way to achieve a very similar effect that can also be art directed and doesn't require a solver. So before I show you the actual effect of the project, let's cover the basics of the technique first. So we start with a simple noise on a grid. In this case, it's just a highly subdivided grid. And this can be any kind of float value, so you don't have to use a noise. I used a fit VOP to make sure the value range is between 0 and 1. And of course, you can do that in a wrangle as well. But for working with different noises, I prefer VOPs for some reason. So here's the core of the effect. Once again, I did not come up with this, and I picked it up in a tutorial years ago. And the idea is to clamp and remap a little range of the incoming values of the noise. So imagine, like in Photoshop, when you use levels and take the black and the white point, bring them very close together with a certain width between them, and then you move them both at once and keep their distance. Well, this is what we do here. So to achieve that, we create a second fit node and 2 parameters, and we call one threshold and the other one width. And threshold will be the source min of the fit, and source max is threshold plus width, so that you keep the distance and move both at once. So if we now drag the threshold slider across, you can see that the noise nicely grows from nothing into full coverage. And with the width slider, you control how sharp the border of the transition effect is. So this is super useful. And since the setup generates a transition effect that follows the direction of the value changes in our noise, we can easily manipulate those values a bit more. So for example, by multiplying a linear ramp onto our noise. So the values on the left side are a bit darker than the ones on the right side. So you just have different intensities there. And if we now animate the slider again, you can see that now the noise follows the direction of those value changes. Here's another example. It's the exact same setup using...
maybe it doesn't play.
Okay. So you have to trust me. There was a...
Oh, no, it plays in
the next one.
Yeah. Now it plays.
Okay. So there it was just a radial ramp. It's the exact same setup, just that I multiplied the radial ramp, and now the whole thing moves in the other direction. So while we were preparing the presentation, I opened this BrainBox scene file again that I'm going to show now and realized that I don't understand anymore what I was doing back then. It happens from time to time when you have complex setups. And regarding the title of our presentation, I thought it would be funny to include our Skype conversation as well. So luckily, node graphs are pretty good to understand if you go through them top to bottom. So I took some time, read through it again, and luckily understood again how it works. So to explain how the Roomscan effect works, I simply created a flat surface for demonstration purposes. And SideFX Labs has a great tool called lot subdivisions, which divides any geometry into those nice irregular rectangles. And you have control about size and also irregularity of the rectangles. And I then used a noise, again, to write different grayscale values onto those primitives. So these will be used later to offset the effect in time, so it doesn't happen everywhere at once. And another thing I used was the intrinsic UV coordinates that every primitive has. So it's possible to easily generate a gradient along or across the primitive. You can see that as well with the 2 arrows here. I then randomly picked one of those 2 gradients along or across the primitive and multiplied this gradient with the grayscale value that I generated in the first step. So in the end, I had a lot of gradients in different directions with varying intensities. I then simply scattered some points on the surface and transferred those calculated values on those points. And combine that with the remap noise setup that I showed in the beginning, and you get this nice, cool scanning effect here. So that follows a random direction on the primitives and is also time offsetted, so it doesn't happen everywhere at once.
Yeah, and looks super complex, but
it's actually quite simple and doesn't require a solver or anything, so you can just animate one slider.
Yeah, very nice. So the next project was really my gateway drug into rotation matrices, as I needed the mirrors in this mirror array to rotate in a quite specific way, and I couldn't figure out how to get that specific effect in another package, not naming any names here. We needed the mirror elements to be able to rotate around their local axes and also target specific focal points for this. Time for some vector math, rotation matrices, and the like. The mirror itself was modeled in Houdini since it has a very specific pattern to it, and I could quickly iterate on it. So this is the out of the initial mirror array. What we get at the end is a bunch of packed primitives, again, that we can now animate using rotation matrices. So this was my initial test code to transform the pieces. The up vector is basically the position of the element pointing to the center. So each element kind of points to the center. That's the up vector. We then calculate the angle the object sits at, create an identity matrix, and basically reset the piece so it's oriented in the y-axis. Then we can rotate the matrix by our pitch and heading angles. Rotate it back to its original angle, so it sits in the original position again. We then reset the position of the element so it sits on the xy plane and add our translation in z. Then for all elements except the center element, we multiply the rotation matrix onto the intrinsic transform matrix of the element. So now we can hand animate our packed primitives with some sliders here, as you can see. All right, test complete. So down there is a much cleaner version of the code that basically does the same, but uses the dihedral function to build that original rotation matrix. And for once, we all like clean code, and we get less stupid as we work. So now to get some procedural animation for the wave effect, we apply a static MOPS falloff to the pieces. So we have a attribute on it from 0 to 1, which kind of tells you the time offset. For the basic underlying animation, we add a simple keyframe animation to the pitch attribute, which doesn't do anything yet, and you'll see in a second why. Because to get some nicer motion, you guessed it, we send that attribute over to ChopNet. Here's what that channel looks like. We then apply a spring chop to it, import our MOPS falloff, and then offset our animation using a channel wrangle. So in chops, you kind of give each instance a different, or shift the animation for each instance. If you want to know more about that technique, I made a nice tutorial about it. It was done way back in H16, but the math doesn't change and it still works great. So now that we have sent our animation through the ChopNet, we can apply it in this wrangle here. So this is our basic keyframe animation. Not too exciting. Looks better with a spring chop. And then with the time offset and the channel wrangle in the ChopNet, it looks much nicer. All right, so like with all the red nodes you see here marked, I could make up the final animation of the mirrors as they're all multiplied on another. So I didn't do like all the animation in one piece, but kind of did all the tiny effects and then multiplied all of it. For the last bit of the animation, I needed the mirrors to focus on specific focus points. So in this wrangle, we bring our target points from outside, which you can see are the tiny dots here, and calculate a rotation matrix using the dihedral function, which basically rotates the rest vector onto the target vector, which we then multiply with the intrinsic transform that's stored on the packed primitives to rotate the incoming pieces. And what we get is this. Like now we can procedurally drive the rotation of all the mirrors with focus points. Yeah, and that's the whole sequence with some fake UI overlaid. So you can kind of see what it does. Yeah, rather technical, not too exciting, but I know it was an exciting project figuring out how to work with rotation matrices and the like. Yeah, I mean,
right?
Yeah.
Okay. Another problem I had to solve in the past was when you have a nice fluid simulation where basically everything is fine, timing, movement, silhouette of the whole thing. And the only thing you need to add is a bit more complexity on the surface. So I found a way to add some surface ripples post-sim, which also gives a lot of flexibility without having to resim everything. And this is how it works. So let's say this is our fluid sim. In this case, it's vellum fluids with some nice viscosity. And as you can see, we have a super smooth surface, but there's not a lot of detail on the surface, so it looks kind of boring. And first of all, I want to have a gradient on my particles from the oldest to the youngest particles in the scene. And since vellum particles don't come with an age attribute, I simply wrote the current time on the emission geometry. And this timestamp is then inherited on the vellum particles which are being born. So each particle has a little tag where it can look up at which time it was born. And that one here was actually Bastian's idea. So if you now use a sine function and with this timestamp that each particle has and a multiplier, in this case it was a slider, you can create those rings that run along your particles. And with a multiplier you can adjust the number of repetitions. So you put in the age of the particles and basically the sign goes between -1 and 1, and you can take that and remap it on a color attribute, for example, and then you have this. So here's the effect in motion. So you can see the rings are born and move with the fluid downwards here in this case. And you can now use those rings to displace the mesh along their normal first, and then also push them slightly in the direction of their velocity to generate those nice overhangs. And here again is a comparison of the initial simulation on the right and the added detail on the left, all without having to resim anything. So it's often a pretty good idea to just start with a basic sim, and before you get lost in there and spend the next 2 weeks on fine-tuning the simulation, just take what you have and see how you can work with that. So that's also a nice trick that I picked up.
Yeah, and what I really like about this setup, or like your approach, is that you set the birth time before emitting from the points. Because I had a similar problem, and I did it in the solver. But you see that it's there's always different approaches, and yeah, everybody does it a bit different, and there's tons of way to figure out problems, and they all hopefully get you to the end. To the solution in the end, hopefully. So this was our first project with Andy from Baked. We wanted to do a tentacle with suction cups at first, but ended up going with a sticky sundew plant instead because it was a better fit for the product. This project was definitely a challenge for me at the time, because if I remember right, I only had about 4 days to set something up for the plant. So I had to go with what I knew at the time, which was a sub-based approach, because I hadn't had any KineFX experience back then. So let's quickly take a look at that. So for reference, this is the scene file for that shot, or one of the shots. Basically, it was just, the cool thing was that it was just one thing the plant needed to do. So yeah, that's why I could kind of hard code like all the deformation and stuff. So it didn't need to be dynamic. The elements that are being rendered are green, and the rest is set up and stuff. The first thing was to get started on the main leaf. So we start with 2 cross sections, which get extruded and tapered. We add a bit of noise to the surface, remesh, scatter some source points for the tendrils, and add some more where it matters. So we snap those to the mesh, define the target points as seed points. Now for the roll-in animation, we bring in our mesh apply a mob shape fall off, which defines what will get rolled in. So it kind of, so that's a fall off. We then set up a bend attribute based on that fall off, as well as a normal and up vector for later. Now we apply a first bend deformer that flattens the leaf when it's curled in relation to that fall off. Some static taper, add the main bend deformer. So that's basically it for the animation of the leaf. Next, look at the setup of the tendrils, which was a bit more challenging. So we bring in our leaf animation, keep the front, blast everything except the seed points. We then fix some of the normals by hand, create some attributes for the copy to point sub, like, that's just the p-scale. And copy 2 lines onto the points, a straight one and a curved one. We then blend between the two using our bend attribute from before. We copy the orientation attributes from the seed points, and we're done with the basic setup for the tendrils. So as they curl in, they kind of blend from one to the other state. To make them stick to the ground, we bring in our surface and the tendril skeletons. We then stick the endpoints to the ground using the min-pos function, like this. So now the endpoints kind of always try to grab onto the surface. We then stick the endpoints to their start positions using a time shift set to frame 1. So they never leave where they first touched the surface. Next, we measure the initial length of the tendril and the animated one. And we now can set up a ratio between those two lengths. Next, we mark the endpoints as to be detached when that ratio is above a certain threshold. We then feed that attribute through a chopnet with a lag chop. So there's a bit of organic lag to when they detach. And now you can see they slowly blend to their rest position once they're detached. That's when the green line gets shorter. So now we update the position of the endpoints, and now have the tendrils slowly pull back and curl in once they're detached. So now they're sticking and slowly pulling away from the, or not, like rather quickly pulling away from the surface and then slow down in the end. So last, we set a sticky group for later and color the points that are sticking to the surface so we can check that everything works. And now we have a sticky skeleton for the tendrils. So we're almost done. So let's take it the render geo for the leaf. We bring in our animated leaf, our tendril skeletons, pull out the seed points where the surface connects with the tendrils, and we have our leaf. Easy. Now for the tendrils, we bring in our skeletons, adjust some misbehaving up vectors again. So yeah, that was the downside with that approach, that I needed to add some tweaks to it. Otherwise, the tendrils wouldn't be like oriented super nicely, like some of them. And those that I could see, I kind of rotated by hand. Then I resampled the curves and add an attribute, or added the attributes for the sweep sub in that wrangle here. Then varied the p-scale and color attributes along the curve and sweep them. And then we flattened the tendrils at their contact points with the leaf. And that's our sticky tendrils, like this. So very simple, just from curves, we get the kind of these nice tendrils. Now that we have the leaf and the tendrils, we add some drops on the leaf, some at the tips, some spider webs, some droplets on those spider webs. Now there's some more action going on with the surface, which I won't get into here, because I thought I didn't have time. I think we were pretty good for time. So because the tendrils basically needed to pull up the surface a bit as they were lifting. So you can see once they're kind of pulling away, they pull the ground up a bit. And you can see it nicely with the droplets. So the last thing we added before rendering was some fur. And here's the whole thing in action. Again, beautifully shaded and lit by Andy at Baked. And I think that was one case of like not overdoing it, because oftentimes you try to build the perfect setup, but as you see, the plant was, you just could see it in like short, very short shots. So yeah, for that it worked great.
I always get so cozy with this music.
Oh, it's a super nice. I love it. It's a super nice spot.
All right. This one here, I worked on a commercial for a mattress for Tendril. And we needed this transition that you can see here, some kind of a wavy foam layers to illustrate the inner core of the product. And so I needed to come up with a solution which looks elegant and is easy to control. So I started out with a simple grid and copied it 5 times. I then deformed it using a noise and offsetted it per copy slightly. This is a pretty good tip, actually, that I picked up from our character animator, Can, who is also in our office, so that when you just offset one animation slightly in time by layer or by joint, you get very elegant wavy motion. So I like that a lot, so I did it here. And since those grids needed some thickness in the end, I needed a simple and fast way to build some fake collisions of the layers to show that they are nice and soft. So I also knew exactly how the shot would look like. I think I already had the animated camera, so I could just make it work for this shot here. So what I did was to let each point check the distance to their corresponding point on the layer above and store this distance in an attribute. So you can see it on those, wait a second, here, those pink arrows here are basically the distances that they can extrude at a max without intersecting.
And since it's 5 grids, you know exactly what point is above, right?
Exactly. So you have your point number and then just add the number of points per grid to get the exact point on the next layer above. So this attribute is now the maximum extrusion of the foam layer at this position, and I could simply clamp the extrusion once it goes above this value. And I then added a little interface just to adjust each layer. And later in the process, which is not in this video here, I also calculated how strong the set extrusion has been clamped and used that value to drive a deformer that bulged out the sidewall of the foam. So you get this nice squishy look of the layers. I think you can see it a little bit here. So wherever those layers touch each other, the one in the middle, that's quite obvious. It bulges out the sidewall a little bit.
It works super nice. Great. Another tiny quick tip I wanted to share from this latest project with Andy is how to temporally smooth orient attributes, a problem that we needed to fix way back when those bottle parts you can see here were still bottle caps. So when we pre-pack the pieces in a simple RBD sim, run them through so we pack them in the RBD sim with rough proxies for the bottle caps. We then extract the transforms of those pieces, use an extract transform sub, and then copy the high-res caps back on for previewing purposes. You can see that the caps are jittering quite a bit, and because of my stupidity, I didn't know how to fix it. So what I did was that I smoothed the positions, which is super easy, as you know. You run them through a chopnet, for example, with a filter chop. So this makes the whole thing look a bit smoother, but fixes just the position. And you can see that there's some slight jittering left. That's the orientation of the caps. And you can't do the like that, run it through a chopnet for the orient attributes. So it's not 3 components for the position, but 4 for the orient attribute, however. because I found if you, I mean, for me, and I didn't know better, if you run the orient through the ChopNet, it will mess up the integrity of the quaternion. And I'm sure someone can explain to me why and how. But I didn't know. So the fix I had for that is to smooth the orient attribute in a solver. And there blend each frame the position with the previous position.
Orientation. Not position.
Orientation, of course. With the slurp function, you can see here. So there's a lerp function for vectors and floats, and slurp for orient attributes, quaternions. So you blend the two with a bias. Yeah? And if you have a bias of 0.5, you take basically half of your previous orientation or mix it half and half. So you get a kind of a smooth dragging effect on the orientation. So now, as you can see, we have removed the jitter, not just in the position, but also in the orientation. And again, keep an eye out for that project on Bake's Instagram as well, because Andy did a super nice job on making the whole thing look awesome.
All right, last but not least, here's a super simple one, but I just liked the result so much that I wanted to share and include it here in the presentation. I worked on this shot with those lines deforming and fanning out in this curly motion, and to create that I built a little subsolver. So I started with a ring and simply used the curl noise that pushes the points along the noise field in each frame. And as you can see, the motion works, but we have a problem here because we don't have enough points. So after a short while, you see that the line gets stretched out and you get those straight edges here. And what you can do is super simple. You just put a resample sub inside of your solver. So each frame, the resample will check the length of your curve and will add points if needed and make it super smooth. And then you basically just copy this ring a few times. I think in that case it was around 10 times. And again, offset the noise per clone a tiny bit, and those lines will start to fan out because each clone has a slightly different noise field, so they will start to fan out. And in that case, I used a noise to mask out this effect. So wherever the line is red, all the copies will share the same noise field, so they stay together, especially in the beginning. And wherever the noise is white, you can see the noise is offsetted per clone quite a bit. And I could then start to spin it around and find a nice moment here, which was that one where it really nicely curls inside. Was a happy accident, and have this super simple but effective and fun setup that I really liked. Yeah, you can see it again.
And that's super nice.
Yeah, that's a cool thing. Not complicated, but it was a lot of fun.
All right, so one last quick tip for when you're feeling stupid, because Houdini isn't doing what you think it should. A tip which you really can apply to any problem in life, I think. And this keeps coming up when we're talking with colleagues and trying to problem solve, right? So first, keep it simple. Break things down to the bare minimum and start from there. Whenever we're solving problems at the studio, it's mostly that the setup or the problem is too complicated, which makes it impossible to figure out what's causing the problem because there's too much going on. Next step, break down further. If things are still not working, break down further until you get something that works. Yeah? So dissect the problem and repeat that as often as needed until you get something you were expecting. Like if 1 and 1 is 3, and it should be 2, there's something wrong in your setup, which you might not see because it's too complex.
Yeah,
so
you have
strip it down.
To simplify until you're at a stage where you know how it should be, so that you really understand what's going on.
In essence, you need to ask why 5 times to really get down to the core of the problem. And once you fixed it, because you were able to identify it, you can turn everything on again.
All right, we were pretty fast now, actually.
Super fast.
We're good in the timing. So we hope there was something in for some of you, and we hope to see you later. If you want to get in touch, here are our websites. You can reach us or talk to us later on the floor. We are somewhere, I guess. And
should be around. That's it.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Very much.
Any questions, anybody? Don't be shy. Been thinking about stuff all along. Feel free to ask.
Or ask later.
Or ask later. Or ask now so that everybody can hear it.
Yeah.
But now there's T-shirts. T-shirt.
Hello.
Hello.
Is it sounding? Yeah. Have you ever used chops for anything more advanced than smoothing things?
For more
Advanced than
that's
smoothing.
the most things I use it for, because
Yeah.
it's super convenient and super cool, and it can do loads more. But I found that for chops, I might be wrong, there's not too many resources. I mean, like for all the newer stuff, there's tons of stuff out there. But for chops, yeah, it's been around for like super long, right? And I think like the whole tutorial scene and everything just got its momentum like a couple of years ago. So I think that's a thing that's neglected. So for me, that's super hard to learn. And I was in touch with Andy Lau, who did a book about it, I think maybe 10 years ago. And that's super cool. But yeah, that's one thing that's super hard to learn. But there's so much potential also for rigging, I think, which also, again, might, I don't know if it's still necessary with kinefx and all, but like it was used heavily. But I never got around to like digging in super deep, but I'd love to, yeah, because it's super cool. And I'd like to, for example, know how to like run the smooth on the Orient, for example, like cotangents and stuff. And yeah. Have you? Or?
I guess speculation, but yeah, I use it a lot as well for mostly the same things. But it seems like it's getting out of a bit deprecated in time. Like
yeah, I think there's probably other focus
revamp.
points in the development, but yeah, it's super cool. And yeah, one thing is with the ChopNet that it like processes your whole timeline. Like if you solve something, the ChopNet like can't like really run, I think, before you have everything cached, right? Because it draws the graph. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, but yeah, super cool.
While it's still a bit complicated to work with it and hard to get your head around, I also use it just for this basic things. I still hope that it gets updated because this toolset is so unique, and I don't really know if it's existent in any other package that you have specific tools just to manipulate curves. So animation curves or movements or just like that. It's really unique, and I really like that.
Yeah, and you can feed in MIDI data and like everything, and it's super powerful. Yeah, but I think it has a super steep learning curve. So if anyone kind of, or if you, for example, learn it and tell me, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, we'll see about that. Thank you.
Thanks.
There are some pretty interesting advancements in rigging and animation coming over the next year.
Sweet.
Mysterious. Ooh. Any other questions? Yeah.
So for the flower you did for the Rihanna project, I saw it still had intersections, right?
Yeah,
it was so fast.
Yeah, it was just for social stuff, so it has to be super fast. You could solve that.
Yeah, how would you approach that for such a short time frame? Like, would you do it the same way as like the Soul in the Asics commercial, or
maybe? Yeah, I mean, there's always. I didn't need to do it in that case because it should be like kind of rough and super fast. I need to think about that. Maybe how to solve it. Yeah, maybe it could be easily be done by offsetting the time a bit different, just to make them slide past each other. Or you could start to collide them and mix your animation with a simulated part that they really collide, or I don't know. We can think about
I mean,
that.
the solution to the problem always is dependent on your kind of resources. right? I mean, how many hours you can put in and like how much time you have. So that's, I think, what we find often, that we need to fix the problem in a very specific way, like in the amount of time that we have. So sometimes it would be cooler to like sim it all, but that's, I think, where we have a lot of kind of procedural effects in here, is that you can just scrub through and don't need to solve anything, right? And that's what you like about your growing setup. You don't need to run a sim, like with a Pyro source or something. There's a cool thing that was recently like in a new Pyro sub-level, the spread, effect, right? I think Pyro spread or something. That is super cool, that I like, and I told Simon, and he really likes the instant scrubbiness and like feedback of that other setup that's super easy to tweak and might not be perfect because you have growing islands, for example, but you can immediately see, and then you just change the seed or the offset and you fix it. Yeah, so there's, it's always, you have to consider like how to solve the problem with the constraints of the project. And
cool. Thank you.
Cheers.
Other questions? Well, we've got about 7 minutes extra, which is great because we have some T-shirts here.
Ooh.
So come on up and get a T-shirt, and maybe one last applause for these guys. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.